All right, welcome back to PacWest Bigfoot. This is David, and before we get started with this week's Bigfoot encounter story, wanted to let you know that yes, we have a giveaway coming up here in just a few days, about 5 days away, and I'll go ahead and announce that. And what I'm giving away this month on PacWestBigfoot.com, if you're not there, get there, sign up, is each month I pick someone from the list there. One of you awesome subscribers, and this month's free giveaway prize is actually a sun visor, a Bigfoot sun visor for your vehicle. So that is what I have for you this month, the lucky winner. So I will announce that on the 20th. With that, any other news? Yes, I want to say thank you guys first and foremost, and I want to thank William Jevning for being on last week's interview. That was awesome, and we're going to do some more PacWest Bigfoot interviews. I have a few more people lined up right now. Not to mention, I've got an individual who. He's been doing this for, about 12 years now, researching Bigfoot up around the Washington State area, who's got a lot of really awesome information for us. So I'll be having him on multiple shows, okay? So with that, let's get into this week's encounter story. Let me take this sip of this awesome Sasquatch coffee. All right. This week's Bigfoot encounter story. Bigfoot kills rancher's cattle in Washington State. Where's the beef? The report said it was a pack of wolves. Sorry to tell you, but that is not even close to the truth. Bigfoot stole and killed the cattle from my friend's ranch. It was not wolves, bear, or cougar. As a matter of fact, proof number one. Wolves were not even seen during the mid-'80s around this particular part of Washington State, and if they were, it was a lone wolf. Not enough to do damage here. And two, we saw what it was, and how it took its prey down. Here's what we saw, and what was happening on that ranch that led up to this sighting. That was both amazing and truly terrifying, all at the same time. My friend, the rancher. My friend has been a rancher since I can remember. As a matter of fact, he comes from a family of cattle ranchers out in Montana. He moved here when he was in his early 20s, bought some land, and started raising cattle. Back then, it was a pretty simple process to start a ranch in the state as compared to today, with all the ridiculous obstacles one has to jump over and crawl under to accomplish. But let's not talk about the stupidity of politicians today. This is about something that would make those same politicians pee their silly little selves anyways. I was hired almost day one, and no, I was asked by my friend who owns the ranch not to mention names of people or the ranch. The report states it was wolves, and he wants to keep it that way. But he hates the fact that it makes him feel like a liar, so he said I could share this sighting and encounter with someone, and I chose you, Dave. As I said, I was hired practically day one to help out on the ranch. Feeding and herding cattle is simple. Keeping them safe, well, that's a whole other line of work. My main job was to keep them safe and fed. My friend, the owner of the ranch, dealt with keeping them healthy in the business end of the stick. Personally, I think he wanted my job, but so goes life of the business owner. Besides, I preferred the outdoors, riding horseback through the ranch, and not to mention around the surrounding ridges towering above the valley below. I know it sounds a little goofy, but I'm a cowboy, and I love this lifestyle. And while some ranchers and ranch hands prefer the four-wheeler today, not I. Give me Oreo, my horse, and I am good to go. The property itself is pretty far out of a town called Colville, actually, but that is about the closest place for us to shop and do business. And without giving you directions here, just know that this ranch is surrounded on all sides by mountains. Not tall mountains like the ones further to the west, but mountains nonetheless. And pretty much like the rest of the state, it is a wet place much of the time. The forests are thick, and some of the rocky ridges are home to mountain lions, grizzly bears, not to mention black bears, and other troublesome creatures of the forest for us ranchers. Back then, there were no real wolves for the most part, but today there are. Mostly, however, it is the grizzly and the mountain lion that I look out for around here. Well, until that week, in early fall in the mid-1980s, that is. Here's how it all started and ended. Missing a cow in the back pasture. Like I said, I feed and am part of the protection services of the cattle, and like many ranchers out there, we would move cattle from one area to another for feeding and raising in general. My most unfavorite area was near the back, a section of the ranch that ran into a small grove of pine trees. It was the only part of the land that did. In this part of the property, at least 3 acres or so ran right into and past the tree line. However, there was almost no brush whatsoever. It was mostly just trees that you could see clear through for a good distance, even past the fence. It was like a small peninsula sticking out, I guess, into a sea of green, to tell you the truth. As a matter of fact, while I did not like it for the cattle, there were times I would have my lunch out there. It was nice to listen to the wind blowing through the trees and take a short nap. It was a clear and beautiful day that I decided to move the herd to that particular pasture, then have my lunch near my favorite fallen tree just inside the tree line. Although the cattle are mostly grass-fed, we still kept hay here and there just in case, and that day I had some brought out. I would keep them there for a few days after that. It was Friday, I remember. I know because that day I was late getting home because of the incident, and when I mean late, I was almost missed a date with my fiancée at the time. I got started early milking some of the cows that we kept in the front pasture near the barn, and I cleaned out the barn a bit afterward. Later, I would get some help and move part of the herd to the back pasture. It was around noon when I decided to head back there, have lunch in my favorite spot, then meet up there with the other guys and move the herd before I headed home to get ready for my date. Heading back there, I saw the buzzards in the air, and I knew this was going to be good. It was a cow, just as I expected. No, there was no warning signs at the time of predators running around. I just knew by the number of birds flying overhead that there was a kill of some kind. You just hope that it was not your product. I have to say, this was the beginning of a couple weeks that would be both weird and terrifying. This cow had its neck broken. Actually, it was almost twisted off completely. It was hanging on by some skin and other tissue, and that was about it. It was missing its stomach completely, which was not all that weird, and a whole leg. No, a whole haunch and leg were ripped clean off and gone. Nothing weird about that either, really, except one thing. I've been out here a long time, and this is not my first time witnessing predation of cattle, but there were no bite marks, not one. There was blood everywhere, even splatters and sprinkles on trees more than 10 feet away. As a matter of fact, we would have a professional come out to investigate that morning, as we do and did every time something like this would happen. He too agreed there were no bite marks. It was as if it was torn apart by bare hands. Of course, that was going to be the first of 3 reports we would see. He wrote it up as a bear, mountain lion being the culprit, had torn it apart and took off with its parts of the body. No mention of how it did it, just that it did it was all. As I said, though, no teeth marks. No tracks were found either, just impressions, large impressions that led from the forest and back again. These too were decidedly made by grizzly bears, as they were large. As we all know, a Bigfoot track sometimes, when there are no undeniable toe impressions, can be confused for a bear print. And this was what we all thought, and that was the conclusion we all came to. It looked like that at the time. I would have to pull all the cattle to the front pasture, and some overnight and overtime hours would be put in place for now. It'd be a few days later that a story would come from one of the ranch hands that would not only make us balk at the testimony at first, but he would also walk off the job that day out of pure fear. A scream in the night in another body. I know he does not wish me to use his name, and I won't, but I can say that he is a good friend of mine today. He is the one who first heard the screams and found another dead carcass this time, however, closer to the barn. There was more than cows on the ranch. While we were raising cattle for beef, the owners did have sheep and pigs of their own, and for their own personal consumption. What my friend found, a ranch hand on staff at the time, was the head of a pig about 20 yards away from the pen it was kept in with the others. It was not the frantic squealing of a pig that caught his attention either. As a matter of fact, he believed the kill happened right before he headed out from the main house to make some rounds. What he heard and saw is what caught his attention and scared him off the job less than 24 hours later. He said he had just stepped off the porch and was headed towards the barn when he heard it. It was a scream so loud he half expected the owner to come flying out of the house behind him, but the owner heard nothing over the game he was watching inside. Instinctively, he ran towards the noise, thinking it might be a person in trouble. At least that's what he said it sounded like to him. As he turned the corner around the side of the barn, that is when he first saw the blood everywhere and the upper half of a pig. The blood was running down the side of the barn and all over the ground as if the thing was smacked against it, then torn in half. He said he then heard the movement about 15 to 20 yards towards the tree line to the south from where he stood, and what he saw he described as a tall, dark, scary shadow with glowing red eyes. He could not make out anything but a silhouette, and what he could make out is the other half of the pig and the end of a long arm. With the dim moonlight coming up behind whatever it was, all he could see was backlit shapes. Whatever it was, as he went back over the report the next day, this thing must have been at least 9 feet tall when we went and stood where he saw this thing. The pig's back end was taken, but the upper section, including its head, was left behind, and although we did take a look around the area, we did not find the other half. Once again, we had to call the authorities out, and once again the report stated the same. The cow same as the cow just a few days earlier. However, I was starting to feel differently, as I believed what my friend was saying, even though the authorities investigating the predation were obviously not. Excuse me. That made me upset enough to tell the owner, my best friend, what I thought about the situation. He actually agreed with me, but that did not stop that young ranch hand from quitting that day. He simply felt afraid, he said. I know that was hard for him to admit, but then again, you could tell it in his eyes and his expressions that he did see something truly terrifying that night, and he did not want to ever see it again. Suffice it to say, the next 4 nights would be long ones for me, and that young man would move to the nearest town and live and work there from then on. Tracks and more screams. That very night, after everyone had left and the report was made, screams from the south side of the property could be heard by myself and another ranch hand I decided would help fill in for the empty slot made by my friend who left for good earlier that day. It did sound like a person, I admit. Not quite a female like some report, but I could see why they might mistake it for a person in general. It was late, past 11 p.m. when we decided to take the late night ride around the property. We did not get far when the screaming started. It came down from the low mountain ridge and echoed through the pastures below where we were. It was loud, even though it seemed to have been at least a mile away or so. It sounded like it was closer. I looked over at the other guy, and I could tell he was a little freaked out. It was something neither of us had ever heard before, and we practically lived out here. Suffice it to say, we headed back to the building just in case. It was eerie, almost creepy listening to it. It sounded more like some maniac or person just going completely crazy, or someone being mauled or killed. Some I have heard describe it as the sound of a woman being murdered. I would have to agree with that, I suppose. Of course, we did hang out outside around the main house and barn for a few hours listening intently. Eventually, after about a half hour or so, the screaming stopped, and we were the happier for it, to tell you the truth. That was truly a freaky sound. The next morning, I would head out to that part of the property where we had stood listening to the screaming when it started. It was not until I looked down in a muddy part of the grass near my favorite area in the back pasture that I noticed 2.5 footprints. One was a partial track, the back of a heel to be exact. I did get a measurement of the whole of the whole prints, and about 17. It was about 17 and a quarter inches, is what I would get. What got my boss and me scratching our heads was the fact that they looked like human footprints. We've seen bear tracks, even the ones that look like human tracks, due to the back paw stepping into the same track as the front paw. You get used to seeing that after a few times or more. Over the years, I had, up until that point, seen that at least 5 or 6 times myself. These were not bear paws. These were not paws in paws. These were human-looking prints. Of course, there was a slight difference, like the fact that they were huge and they did not have the deep curve, if you will, we have on the side of our feet. These were almost straight on both sides. Almost. We did not know what to say. All we could do was call the local sheriff's department and let them know what we found. We also decided to have a 2-person detail every night from then on until we could figure out who or what it was that was invading the property and killing the animals. My boss would also be a part of that security details. He was like that, a hard worker and dedicated to his faith, family, friends, and his business. Grab, twist, and snap. While I did keep this account short for you, I'm going to give you some details, gruesome detail about the early evening when myself and my boss found out exactly what it was attacking the cattle, and it was nothing we would have ever dreamed up. We decided to head out to the back acres that evening for dinner. I was usually invited into dinner when I worked in the evenings. As I said, we were also great friends. We also would decide to walk that evening. The horses might be a little too loud, and when the moon was as full as it was that night, the light might give an animal all the more reason to hunt down in the pasture. And we were right. It, and I mean it, did. We gathered what we needed, like flashlights, and of course we were armed. It took us a bit to walk out to the back pastures. We decided to stop where I first noticed the tracks of the first dead cow. We sat on one side of the deadfall. We sat on one of the deadfalls right at the edge of where the tree line began. We kept a small talk and at almost a whisper. Every few minutes or so, my boss would turn on the flashlight and cast a beam out towards the other side of the part of the pasture. To the northwest were some cattle, and for the most part, up until that moment at least, they had been a little scattered. Now, all of a sudden, they seemed to be huddled closer together, away from the tree line, more towards the center of the open area. He then flashed his light around, especially towards the tree line, and noticed something huge that looked like it might be a cow lying down in the grass. However, because of the distance it was from us, the beam of light was not very revealing. I suggested we move from our current position to the other side of the pasture slowly. This way we could use the natural light of the moon to see better what that thing is laying out in the field. Was it a cow? Another dead one? We made it over and knelt down enough to see everything much clearer than with the artificial light. Amazing how that works, to tell you the truth. I also suggested that we keep the flashlights off unless we really need them. And there we were. And we could see that the cattle had moved into an even tighter pack than just a few moments earlier, before we moved to the opposite side of the pasture. As I was looking at them, they started moving. Some even started to rustle around a bit and called out with moos. At that point, we noticed the thing on the ground about 40 feet away from them move, and it looked to be on all fours for a second. Then, all of a sudden, it stood straight up, like a person. It was tall. We could not get a good estimate, but it was at least a couple heads or 3 taller than me, and I'm a shade under 6 foot. We dared not raise our rifles at him. We thought it was a person, after all. But that thought was fleeting when it went to all fours for a split second again, and then shot up and off in the direction of the cattle, like a gold medalist in some race. It made it to the herd in about 2 seconds flat, with strides I could not believe without seeing it. At that moment, we could tell from the well-lit area that this was no person. The shape was far too large, and the speed and top of the body was just, massive. As we stood up quickly, we noticed this thing. As it reached the herd, it picked up a cow by its head. It was so amazing, scary, and crazy all at the same time to watch this thing. It grabbed a large cow by its head, practically lifting it up off the ground, which was amazing all by itself, to tell you the truth. As it did, it immediately yanked the cow one way, and fast as it did that, the body of the thing and its arms flung back the other way sharply and quickly. The head came practically clean off of the cow in a split second. I don't remember hearing a single sound from that cow, only the movement of that thing and the loud snapping of a cow's neck. It was that fast. Once it was dead, the thing literally started taking it apart, and quickly. What was really scary, though, was the fact that this monster of a thing knew we were there. It kept turning its body in our direction every few seconds or so, then turning back again to the dead cow. We could not see it tear the cow apart exactly, but you could tell by the movement that it was. Hours later, after sunrise, we would see that it had emptied its stomach and took a hind quarter clean off. I remember watching it take something, toss it over its shoulder before it stood up, turned, looked in our direction, then walked off into the tree line. Of course, we had every right to shoot this thing, this Bigfoot, for predation of cattle. Every cattle owner has that right on their property. But Boss Man put his hand over my rifle and nodded his head as if to say no, not to shoot it. And let me just say this, even if you don't believe me, this Bigfoot was strong, powerful. It lifted that cow up off the ground and by its head and literally snapped it off. Why did he not want to take this thing down at the time? I don't know. Later, however, my boss, my friend, well, he simply felt like he should not shoot it. It's just a feeling, he stated. Locking down the ranch. It was a couple of days later after the killing that we would have an all-hands-on-deck meeting. First, we talked about what happened that night, and trust me when I say everyone knew and believed what we were saying was true. As a matter of fact, one of our other hired hands told us of an encounter his mother had near Olympic National Forest years back. Suffice it to say, we also discussed shooting off the guns out near the back of the property near the woods more often. Maybe that would keep this thing away. We think it worked, so far at least. Plus, the boss took a little pay cut himself and hired one more guy for security purposes. I know it was not just for the cattle either, or his business in general. He had a wife and a kid on the way too. I think he was thinking of them as well. I did not blame him one bit either for that decision. Even today, decades later, while we have not seen or heard anything out of the ordinary, and the killing of the cattle had stopped, we still keep that extra hand on today for security. I still eat lunch out there today in my favorite spot, though, and I think about that night. Then I come back to the present, look around me, and am glad it is gone, and hopefully for good.